Hey guys, welcome to Airsoft Mechanics Podcast. This is episode 10 in the entire series. I feel like we've been doing it for much longer than this, but
Double
oh
digits.
well. Episode 10. So, we are back from last week and we're going to be discussing, you know, our traditional outline. And then, like we said last week, we're going to talk about the RA split shell again today
Hell
because
yeah. Lots to talk
Ryan
about with that thing.
Ryan got his split shell in and he wants to talk about it. So, but first, we
Gotta.
gotta talk about our recent builds.
All right, I'll let you start because I'm gonna just go on when I get
Oh
a
yeah, because your
chance.
your recent builds are going to involve the fact
Yeah.
that
At least one of them. Yeah. So.
yeah. Um. All right. Well, I'll start us off then. Um. So recently, I have been doing a lot of work to a VFC or well Elite Force 4 CRS, and it was like a basic build, like the guy's piston stripped, and when I opened it up, there was a lot of problems actually. The tab plate was like worn beyond belief because it was VFC. Um, the piston, like obviously it was gone completely. He wanted me to replace the air nozzle, the tap plate, replace the piston, put an M110 in so it's getting on 380, and he wanted me to install a new retro arms trigger. So I was like, okay, sure, I'll be up for that. So he got all the parts to me, installed them all, and I had tons and tons of trouble with the RA trigger. Like, holy crap, this thing is a pain. Um, had to modify the trigger, had to modify the trolley, um, and yeah, it finally works. But it took me about an hour of solid work on this thing just to get it done, and had to use a lot of critical thinking. I guess you could say. But shimming it and like correcting AOE, that was like super straightforward. And then like there was no problem with the whole build until I got to the trigger, and I was like, this is gonna be annoying. So that's that. And I was gonna start on a Masada DSG build, but then I was like looking through all the parts that the customer sent, and I'm missing the specific selector plate, so
Hmm,
I can't do that. So yeah.
that's annoying.
Yeah. And I got a KWAM4 for $5. So I've been working on that a little bit. I didn't do any tuning to the gun itself. I just put Dean's connectors on it, and I took the horrible paint job off of it and left it looking like it was Fallout. So I just kind of like keep it like that. I wish had the video running right now because I'd show it, but it's really really cool looking. I think I've always wanted to make an apocalyptic rifle, and I think this is what's going to be it. And so whenever I get the free time, I'm going to open up this KWA and do a little bit of tuning, like just AOE correction and like a little bit of cleanup like that, and just get it working on par, and then run it stock until it dies. Because I don't really want to spend money on it right now. But the best part about this gun was that I got it for $5 at an airsoft game where there were a bunch of vendors at Fallen Warriors, and the guy was like, "Yeah, you look like the type of guy that would want to build and upgrade guns." And I was like, "Yeah, that's kind of my job." And he was like, "Oh, so I'll sell you this gun here for $5." And I was like, "Huh." So I picked it up. I looked at it. I mean, you can't really go wrong with $5 to begin with. If it's Tokyo Marui
I don't
spec,
know. It was a KWA.
okay, yes.
Just kidding.
you you can't go wrong for $5 to be flat out honest. As long as the gun is Tokyo Marui spec, I would have probably bought it. But
Might
I
seem a good $5.
it was completely covered up by paint, so I couldn't see any trades at all. And so I was like looking at it, and I popped the rear pin, and it's a KWA, and I was like, oh, I'm buying this. So I bought it for $5. And the problem is that the guy that had worked on the gun or done something to it had opened up the grip, like where the motor is, and reversed polarity on the motor connectors.
Tell me the motor was just spinning backwards, so the guy thought it was locked up and broken.
That was it.
That's so awesome.
So I got I basically like a 2GX KWA M4. I'm saying KWA, but KWA M4 for $5. So yeah, I'm pretty good at that. I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, that's. I
But
really wish I got deals like that.
just if okay, like if I wasn't as like I'm not saying I'm a super nice person, but if I wasn't a nice person, I would probably take advantage of so many people at Fields because like so many kids there. And I'm not trying to bash kids, but like a lot of kids there, they have G and GM4s, like JGM4s, and like it'll stop working, and they'll start asking around if anybody can fix it, and I end up being the guy they bring it to. And so this kid's like, hey, my gun's not working, can you fix it? And I pull the trigger, and the motor height is just like really low for whatever reason. So I turn it up, to as best as I can get it, to where it sounds pretty good. I'm like, there you go, there's your gun working again. So I mean, I could have been like, yeah, your gun's broken forever, and it's never gonna be working
Yeah.
again. I'll give you $20 for it. So, I mean,
Cut your losses now, kid.
yeah, like a tech could be really, really mean.
I'm sure there are people out there that do that too.
I know there are.
Evil.
I talked to him.
Talk to
I had to just grab my KW4 off the wall. It's quite.
Oh, he has to be holding it.
I do. I'm popping the rear pin right now.
Well, I'm holding something too, but I'm not as affectionate about it as you are about that KWA.
Hey, you got it for cheaper than what I got this for.
That's true. That's very true. But I was a second away from throwing it out the window today. Very, very close to becoming part of my yard.
One with the yard.
Yeah.
Well, that's basically my recent builds. I'll let Ryan take his part of this away because his is much more interesting, honestly.
I will try to. So my most recent build, obviously, my DSG M4. I swapped the Lonex Gen 2 shell for a RetroArms split shell that RA sent to me specifically for testing because of all the problems that the split shell had. I'm going to try and not talk about split shell as much yet because I have an entire list of things I'm talking about today. But just in the build itself, I was able to get it to work for a very short amount of time yesterday when I brought it to the field, and it was a 8-tube 10-to-1 DSG on an M170 spring with a 16 TPA motor on an 11.1, and it was shooting about 67, 68 rounds a second, and semi-spamming really, really, really heated up this motor. So I was using a JG Red in this setup, and I really should not have been using a JG Red. Now, the way JG Red sets up their motors is that they're very nice motors, actually. Overall, I love a lot about them. The problem is that the end bell is aluminum, which is nice. But because the end bell is aluminum, in order to not short out the motor when you use it, they have to put a layer of plastic insulation underneath the metal tabs that you connect your motor connectors to, and they're the same tabs that hold the brushes in place. Well, what JG decided to do was, instead of making just a layer of insulation and then putting the tab on like normal, what they did was they made a layer of insulation and then cut holes through the tabs, and the pegs that hold on the brush springs are actually plastic and they're part of the insulation. So what happened is my motor got so hot from running on that setup yesterday, the plastic insulation actually completely melted. And because of that, the pegs that held in the motor brush springs also, like, they came out of place because the pegs themselves melted and came off the motor, so the springs are no longer there, and the motor smoked up and stopped working because, one, melted plastic got everywhere, but two, the brushes were no longer contacting the commutator, so literally the motor couldn't work anymore. So I will be fixing this motor. It should be up and running again, but I will be putting it into a different build eventually. It's not meant for that gun at all. I wish I could show you the picture because the motor it looks kind of funny with the entire end belt just melted. But then off of that, I have a kind of list in my head of things I need to do, personal guns to my SMP'd Masada. I have a new D-Boys AKS-74U that I have a whole build list for. My SCAR is in pieces, waiting to be put back together. It's becoming another DSG build. And my SR-25, I even have plans for that. But all these things are getting pushed off to the side until I fix the RetroArms build, which is my current gun I'm working on. And this is what we were going to talk about next, is just kind of reviewing the RetroArms split shell. So before I say anything, the way I would classify the shell is that it has a lot of potential. This shell has, how's the best way to word it? It can be an amazing shell that just trumps every other shell in the industry right now. It has the potential to quite literally surpass every other shell in the market in every single way. but it does not, and it falls very, very far short of that as of right now. I would classify the shell I got as a failed beta test of a product. I'm actually pretty disappointed that this shell is on the market right now and you can buy it, because you should not be able to buy it with the amount of problems that I had with it. And after saying that, I guess I'll start getting into some other problems. So, as a general overview, I will start with the good and I'll work my way down to the bad, and then I'll get more specific. Now, the strength of the shell. I've only had it for half a week. I've only been able to test it one day, and out of the day, my motor melted halfway through the day, so I couldn't keep testing it. I really haven't had enough time to thoroughly test the strength of the shell, if it has any weak points, because there is actually a weak point I have identified, and I'm waiting to see if I can break it there. So I haven't had enough time to test that enough yet. But as of right now, the shell, it's CNC'd out of 7075 aircraft grade aluminum, excuse me. Basically, it has the potential to, in everyday airsoft setups we run, never break, which is amazing. Like, this is something that you would buy in your primary build. You want reliability, you want it to work, you don't want to have issues. This would be the shell you buy. However, the RetroArms non-split shell also does that. So these are things that go back and forth. I'm reviewing specifically the split shell, not the normal RetroArms version 2 or version 3 shells right now. So strength, it has the potential to be extremely strong. I haven't been able to test it yet. The cylinder window comes pre-radiused. There's no cons about this. This is something that every single experienced tech will do to a gun anyway, so the fact that it comes properly pre-radiused from the factory is it's a huge plus. The wire channels on the inside of the shell are extremely wide. I was able to fit 14 gauge wire in there without problems, which is something I cannot say about any other gearbox shell I've ever had. I've always had to Dremel out the wire tracks for 14 gauge, let alone sometimes even 16 gauge wiring to fit in properly. The wire tracks, there's actually a shelf underneath the pinion gear. So if you've ever had a gun where you had improper motor alignment when you were building and your motor shredded the wires that ran underneath, the RA shell actually makes the wires sit further down than normal, and they have a metal shield that basically sits between those wires and your pinion gear. So at no point in time will your pinion gear ever shred your wires. Now, the downside is that, is it possible your pinion gear could shred this metal shield? Technically, yes. However, I've had immense motor misalignment issues in mine so far, and the way they place the shield, I haven't had a pinion gear hit it too badly yet. So the fact that I'm having this many issues and it's barely touching the shield, you shouldn't ever have to worry about that when they fix the shell and the spacing, which I'll get into later. The quick spring change is extremely convenient. I absolutely love being able to put in an M170, M190 spring with no effort at all. It just makes disassembly much, much easier.
Yeah, I will say, like, I do love the quick change design. It's just super cool. But there's a problem that they do with it, and I'm not going to get into that since you're talking about this. But it made installing that MS210 spring a lot easier. So go ahead and continue if you want.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were getting into the fault in it. Anyway, so the quick spring change, the way they set it up, it's just extremely, extremely convenient, and it makes disassembly and maintenance so much easier. Actually, this is one that people don't often notice. Tuning a hair trigger is so easy now. So if you ever had a hair trigger where you modify with a grub screw in the back, and if you have a Speed Airsoft brand straight trigger, for example, they come with this, and you basically tune the grub screw in the back, and that changes the position that the trigger starts in the throw. So, for example, I run a Spectre FET. So what this does is if I put that screw and tighten it down, the trigger moves closer and closer to touching the micro switch on the Spectre FET. So my trigger pull is extremely small. Now, because of the split shell design, I can literally throw the FET and the trigger in the shell, close up the lower shell, and just take a screw and tighten it, pull, tighten it, pull, tighten it, pull, until I get it exactly where I want. Previously, you couldn't do this. You had to take everything apart, tighten the screw down, put it all back together, test it, and just repeat that process. So it just makes that a lot simpler. The anti-reversal latch design, I really, really like it. The downside is that it's proprietary. So if you break it, you have to buy another one through RA. The upside is that you no longer have to worry about your ARL lining up with the gearbox shell when you're clamping the shell down. So again, it's another feature that just makes disassembly and reassembly so much easier. Your ARL never pops out. You don't have to worry about it lining up, and you don't have to worry about trying to clamp your shell down and the ARL moving to the side and stopping it from shutting completely. Again, they have a bunch of these small details that just make it so much easier to work on the gun. The bad part about this is that they also added a release for the anti-reversal latch. So there's a cutout in the gearbox shell where you can just take a screwdriver and manually release the ARL from the gear, which is awesome. The bad part is where they put this cutout. So what they should have done is had an external system, kind of like, I think ICS does it this way, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, but they have an external system where you can push it and it will actually release the ARL for you.
Yep.
The way RA, okay, good. So the way RA does it is they make you basically be the system yourself, so they just have a cutout, so it makes it easier, but you can't access the cutout unless you take apart the entire gearbox shell or the motor grip. And if you're taking off the motor grip, well, that's just how you would always release the ARL on any other gun anyway, if you ever done the paperclip mod or similar. So it's not any easier. It's still the same process. So it's cool that it's there, but it's not adding too much.
It's just there. It's an advantage for a full-size gearbox, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Like the Lonex gearbox shells and VFC gearbox shells have it, and that makes them really cool. But they're a full shell, not a split. So, it's useful then.
Exactly. And then the finish on the shell is actually really, really good. The machining is very well. The finish is very, very, very good. There's one spot that seemed like it was finished very rough that wasn't supposed to be on the outside, but it was the very top of the shell that doesn't contact anything at all, so it didn't make any difference. And now some of the bad. So the bad is that, if you ever looked at a gearbox shell, and then a version 2 gearbox shell, and towards the rear, there's the cylindrical piece where the piston will sit, and on most gearbox shells, not all, but most, there's a cutout. It's called the piston window in that area where you can see where the piston is during its cycle. The RA split shell doesn't have that, and it's a personal quirk of mine. Like, I don't like shells that don't have that because I like the ability to see where my gun is in the current cycle. Personally, I like to do that for resetting springs. I don't like to leave a spring cocked halfway back when I put my gun away, because some of the guns I build, especially for customers, they even have overspin. So when I'm provided parts, and I don't get to choose the parts all the time, sometimes the 14 TPA motor on 12-to-1 gears with a weak spring produces overspin. So even if you shoot your gun on semi before putting it away, it doesn't always reset the piston in the right spot. So I like to be able to see where the gun cycle is, and especially important on a split gearbox shell, because if you're taking the upper half of the gearbox shell off, aka using the split functionality, like it was made for, and the cycle is halfway cocked with the piston, you can actually break things. So you can actually snap your tappet plate, and you can cause your piston to shoot forward, and if you don't have high quality gears, or for example, if you have a plastic tube piston, you can actually strip your piston just taking your gearbox shell apart. So for me, this was a big con that it didn't have. Now, I don't know if for structural integrity reasons, that's why they didn't have it, because they do have a piston window type system in their normal gearbox shell, I think, but they don't in the split. So unless it was for structural integrity, because the gearbox shell is split, so you need to kind of dissipate the force differently than you would have in a normal gearbox shell, it should have this. Because it is the split gearbox, it's not only a little kind of like nitty-gritty thing anymore. Like, you actually need to know where your gearbox is in the current cycle, or else you can break things by simply using the split functionality and taking it apart. Now, in the tappet plate. So the way they run the tappet plate pegs in these, if you ever opened a gearbox shell before, version 2, you know that your tappet plate sits and there's a spring. Now the spring goes on a peg connected to the gearbox and the tappet plate. And in the RA shell, that peg is actually, you can unscrew it, which is a really, really, really cool feature because it allows you to not have to stretch your spring to try and hook it on to the peg and the tappet plate at the same time. You can put everything in and put the spring on last and just hook the spring on the peg and then move the peg back and screw it in. And it makes the process extremely simple. However, the problem is that it sits in the threads really, really loosely. It actually unscrews itself just from me moving the gearbox around. That's how loosely it's in the threads. So I ended up having to Loctite mine in place, and then that just completely got rid of the ability to remove it and make it simpler. So it's not a con because it's almost like the ARL release hole. They added a feature, but the way they added it doesn't actually add anything to the gun at all because you can't use it the way they intended. And now this is more of the major problem. So that was kind of a quick overview of the shell and some of the features it has. And I'll recap here because of that. That is why the shell has so much potential. It can be something that is very, very great in the airsoft industry right now. It has a lot of things going for it, a lot of features on it that other shells don't have. A lot of leeway in the market because of that. It kind of has its own area now that ProWin isn't making their splits anymore. However, even with all these features I was telling you, even in just the features, there's already some problems. And this is where we're going to get more into. So, the receiver fitment. So, as a forewarning, RA has made it crystal clear that this gearbox shell was designed to fit in GMP receivers, and they do not guarantee it fits in any other receivers. They've announced that, they've said that, they've made that public. Now, I have a GMP receiver, so the gun I was testing this in, I actually have a GMP lower, I have a GMP upper, I have a GMP outer barrel, I have a GMP rail, and I have a GMP pistol grip. So quite literally, every single piece of my gun that contacts the shell is GMP. There's nothing else that I have in the gun except for my buffer tube itself is an old A&K one, but I was doing most of my testing without the buffer tube on anyway, so that doesn't affect it. And my charging handle is an A&K one. However, that actually was one of the 3 brands of charging handles that I was able to get to fit. So again, it didn't affect anything. So the way that the gearbox shell fits in the GMP receivers. However, the small pin that goes right above the trigger that fits in the middle, it fits in there extremely loose. To the point where the lower shell actually has a lot of play in the lower receiver until you put in the rear pin. And the problem with this is that the rear pin isn't exactly lined up with the pinholes on the receiver. So what happens is that the RA lower shell actually sits slightly forward, so where the pinholes are on the receiver. So in order to get a pin through, you have to actually kind of force it back a little bit, and it fits in extremely tight. Which is good because it locks it in place, but it's bad because it causes issues down the road that I'll talk about.
Can I ask a question there?
Yes.
I have a question. Okay, so when you tested that, did you put all the pins in? Like, could you fit all the pins in before putting on the motor grip?
Oh yeah. So
okay.
This is where it is. The motor grip was not on yet, and it's still having this issue of.
Oh, okay.
So basically, I wish I had video to show you guys, but
we're working on it.
Yeah, we are working on it. We tried to get it set up for this podcast beforehand, and it didn't quite work, so we're hoping for sometime soon. But I will also have a video on my channel of the full review. So I'll try not to take up too much time on the podcast, just kind of blabbing about it. But basically what happened, you can even see there's wear on my RA shell's pinion guide hole because it's not lining up right. So the way that pin guide hole. Basically, the lower half of the shell sits in the lower receiver, and you have to put the 2 pins in, the small pin right above the trigger, and the rear pin that kind of locks the body in place. The problem is that the rear pin doesn't line up, so the pin holes on the RA lower sit slightly forward of where they should be. So, actually, no, I lied. They sit slightly farther forward or farther back. Damn, it's off one way or the other. It's not in the shell right now. I'm testing something else with it, but moral of the story, they don't line up properly. So, in order to get the rear pin in, you actually have to force the pin backwards a little bit. And that jams the pin in place, so it sits really, really tight, and it pulls the shell a little bit. And this creates more issues when we'll get into next with the motor alignment. So again, even in a GMP body with the GMP pistol grip, the motor alignment is extremely off. So the way that the upper shell locks onto the lower shell, because it's hard to explain. There's fitment issues with every part of the shell. So basically, the lower locks into the body, like I said, and the pin pulls on the lower. It pulls it back a little bit. Then the upper locks into the lower. Then the buffer tube locks into the upper, and the buffer tube tilts the entire gearbox assembly up a little bit. And then the pistol grip locks into the lower, and that pulls the entire thing down a little bit. So you just have misalignment issues in every single part of this gearbox shell, the way it fits into the body. And I think the reason for that is the gearbox shell actually, like I said at the beginning, it fits really loosely into the body. So it's enabling every single thing that contacts it to influence where it sits. The motor grip screws pull it down. The buffer tube screw tilts it up and pulls it back a little bit. The pins themselves, the pins don't even line up right. The pins put pressure on it and pull it back and force it to have a tight fit. And the issue with the receiver is that the receiver's fine. This is the stock GMP receiver that they said they built the shell for. Again, I wish I could show you. It even has the GMP trades on it. Like, this is a legitimate GMP receiver. Nothing's different. It doesn't even fit into this properly, and it gets manipulated around in this way too much. So that's one of the big issues, which contributes to some other issues. So what happens... Where was I? Okay, so when the shell is screwed onto the buffer tube and it tilts the receiver up, that creates fitment issues with the upper... Sorry, it tilts the shell up. That creates fitment issues with the upper receiver of your gun. So, basically, as you're putting this gun together, every single thing you screw into the gearbox changes how the rest of the pieces in your gun fit. And what I noticed is, when I was field stripping my gun yesterday, because it was having problems, of course, when I went to go put the upper back on, all of a sudden, the upper wouldn't lock in place. It was sitting too high up. And I realized that when I assembled the gun that morning, I didn't have the buffer tube on. Like, I put the upper receiver on before I attached the buffer tube on. And at the field, I only needed to pop off the upper to inspect the hop-up. So I popped off the upper, inspected the hop-up, popped it back on, and it wouldn't fit. And I realized that I kept testing this, and I eventually realized that the buffer tube, when you screw it on, it tilts the entire gearbox shell upward, and it actually creates misalignment with the upper receiver. So, again, it's another seemingly small thing, but it's creating a lot of these issues that just shouldn't be there. The selector plate alignment. Basically, the gearbox shell has overhanging tabs that hold the selector plate in place, and the RA one, it leaves a lot of play for the selector plate. So, what happens is that makes it compatible with more selector plates because they're not too tight, so they'll all fit. But if you're using a computerized MOSFET, not a normal trigger contact setup, if you're using a normal trigger contact setup and cutoff lever, all the selector plate does is it pushes one thing or the other. It either pushes the spring, which pushes the cutoff lever into position, or it pushes the safety latch to engage safety on your gun. It doesn't do anything else. On a computerized MOSFET setup, it has to contact two spring-loaded tabs. So what happened is there was so much play in the selector plate in the way it fit, the spring-loaded tabs were actually strong enough where instead of getting depressed by the selector plate, they were pushing the selector plate away from them. And enough where it caused issues for my MOSFET to turn semi-auto and full auto modes on because the tabs weren't getting pushed down like they were supposed to. This is easily fixed. You have to obviously tighten the tracks and wrap the selector plate, the part that contacts these spring-loaded tabs, in tape. It's a common fix. It happens in other guns. It's nothing that's like new, but it's just the fact that the RetroArm shell has this, and you would think that $155 shell that's kind of advertised as this perfect shell that's going to beat everything else, it wouldn't have these small quirks that you see on the cheap China-made shells that have poor QC issues, and that's why they have them. So that was a small, like for example, I had to do this on my SMP build with the A&K shell, but I expected to have to do that. It was a cheap shell; it cost $10, not $155. Now, charging handle compatibility. This one's a fun one. So this goes back to the gun being said to, it's made for GMP. It's made to GMP spec. GMP happens to make their AEG charging handles a little slimmer than TM spec. So the only 3 brands of charging handle I've been able to get to work with this gun in a GMP receiver was GMP, King Arms, and A&K. So far, every other charging handle brand I've tried was too thick and it would not fit with the shell. Buffer tube screws. So I personally have not had an issue with the buffer tube screw being compatible. I have had the issue where it tilts the gearbox up, which I already explained. But with the screw simply being compatible, that's been fine so far. And I have not been able to test fitment in other brand receivers because I have not been able to get it to fit properly in the GMP brand receiver, so I'm focusing on that first. Now we're going to move away from fitment and move toward the proprietary hop-up because there's a whole slew of issues with the hop-up on this shell. Firstly, on the hop-up feed tube. So this is the tube on the hop-up that will come down and contact the magazine, and BBs will actually feed through it. What RetroArms does is they put an O-ring on this feed tube, and I hate this O-ring. There's no reason to do this at all. So what this O-ring does is 2 things. One, since the BB cannot pass through the feed tube without a little bit of force now, there's a potential that it causes feeding issues with either mags that have weak springs or mags that are pushing heavier BBs, so the springs aren't working as effectively. Especially if you have a mag with a weak spring pushing heavier BBs, and now there's resistance in the path, all it does is create another potential for more feeding issues. The other thing it does, which is actually a safety hazard, which I noticed at the field because I discharged my gun by accident, that's how I picked up on it. The O-ring keeps BBs in the hop-up chamber. So after you take your mag out and fire off the last few rounds, you go semi a couple times to clear the chamber, the O-ring sits down far enough where there's a good 2 or 3 BBs just sitting in your hop-up chamber after you do that. So if your gun's tilted the wrong way and you discharge it again, it can actually shoot a BB. Or multiple in my case.
Yeah, that happened to Jacob and I.
Yeah, it did when you guys were working on it?
Yeah, I noticed it, and I was like, he didn't notice it at first. I think I was the one who spotted it, and I showed it to him. I was like, dude, this is like a legitimate safety hazard. And he looked at me and he was like, yeah, totally. Like that was like where my mind first jumped to. Like it's funny. Like we actually, it was just kind of a funny thought. I thought at the moment that both of us simultaneously thought of, this isn't just a build issue as far as functionality. This is a legitimate safety issue. Like both of us were kind of like, whoa, somebody could lose an eye pretty quick. We were kind of surprised by that.
So yeah, just to completely agree with that is, especially where if you're buying this shell, you're usually buying it because you have a really nice build you're putting into it. And where I'm the local tech at all the fields I go to, everyone's always asking me to show off my builds and to fire my gun and to see my gun and to test it and to try it out and things along that line. So if I had this, and by the way, I did take this O-ring out, so I am not having this issue anymore. I took it out and I just put it to the side. I don't plan on ever putting it back in. But let's say I didn't notice the issue right away and I was letting some kid try out my gun. So he takes out the mag and I clear the chamber for him. And then I give it to him and say, here, you can try this and cycle it. He goes to pull the trigger, he's fooling around with it. He's assuming it's empty, I'm assuming it's empty, and all of a sudden 3 BBs come out of it. Like, that's just something that isn't safe, because it's not rare for me to give my gun to someone else in the field because they see me shooting it and they want to test fire it and they ask. So if I take my mag out, if I clear the chamber or think I clear the chamber, then give it to them, and now they're assuming the chamber's clear as well. They're doing their own thing with it, pointing it around, shooting it, pretending to go through the field with it, and a BB all of a sudden comes out. Like, it really actually can hurt someone. Which is, well, the way I found out at my field is I was actually diagnosing a hop-up issue, and I thought the chamber was cleared, and then I was test firing my gun. I was seeing how the air nozzle contacted the hop-up bucket, which I'll get into it later, different issue. But 2 BBs actually fired out of the gun, and I thought it was clear, and that's when I picked up the O-ring was keeping them in the chamber.
Like,
oh, here, perfect. Oh, yep.
Oh shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Okay. And then, but yeah, my bad.
What was it? What was it? Yeah, okay, I was gonna say, like the counterpoint to, like, it being a, like, an issue there, I guess it's like, the scenario you were giving, like, the counterpoint to that would be something like, you should never assume your gun's, not loaded. But even still, like, we know how our guns work, and we know that, when you pull out the mag, there's still probably going to be a couple rounds in the hop-up.
Oh, no, you never should, but there's, like, yeah.
Like, you like, as soon as you pull your mag out after a game, you clear the chamber, obviously, because, like, that's when it is safe. And so that's, like, when you're like, yeah, okay, this gun's safe. Now I can go into the safety area, take off my goggles, set it down without fear of, somebody getting hurt. But if you have a retro arms gearbox shell installed, assuming you don't have any other problems at all, and there's a couple rounds in your hop-up chamber still, and then, like, you pick it up to, point it at the ground and shoot even, and it ricochets and hits somebody in the eye, because I have played at a game before where a BB has ricocheted off the ground and actually scratched somebody's cornea. So, and that's not good either. And people assumed it wasn't loaded. So, like, the retro arms gearbox, the way it's designed, the hop-up chamber, you're like, yeah, this gun isn't loaded because I did the thing I do to, most other guns. So, like, and then somebody, loses an eye or damages their eye. So, I mean, like, that's a stupid issue. That's just, like, that shouldn't be there at all. So.
Yeah, it really shouldn't be.
No matter what you say, it's a legitimate safety concern.
What the benefit is. Just the,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, oh no, I was gonna say that the problem with me is that I don't even see what the benefit of that O-ring being there is. It's like a extra feature they wanted to add to make it like seem like it was more streamlined, I guess, but it really wasn't working. Okay, and then so the next issue would be the air nozzle, bucking, barrel, and hop-up compatibility. They are absolutely terrible in this gun. So there's different issues that amount to this, but what it comes down to basically is that the retro arms hop-up, the way the hop-up, I'm grabbing one so I can look at it. And so I have a Lonex hop-up in my hand right now. And if you're looking at the chamber, the Lonex V2 hop-up, the feed tube goes into the main hop-up chamber. Then this main hop-up chamber moves forward, and that's where your bucking and barrel are seated, and that's also where the hop-up arm comes down to apply hop. This is normal. This is how it's supposed to be. The retro arms hop-up chamber, the area cut out for the C-clip that is supposed to lock your barrel in place is actually it's in the wrong spot. The area for the C-clip is, I don't know exactly how much. I have to remeasure it, but it's probably about 3 to 4 millimeters farther back towards the gearbox than it should be. And what the problem this causes is that every barrel has notches cut out on it, and those notches are meant for the C-clip to lock into, and that's what keeps your barrel in place. However, with the retro arm, since the C-clip cutout is too far back, the notches aren't lining up in the right spot in the C-clip cutout. So the C-clip can't lock into the notches, and it effectively does nothing. So what happens is that your barrel sits there unstabilized, and it's not in the right position. Basically, there's nothing to lock your barrel in place. So when you're firing the gun, the air nozzle slowly pushes your barrel outward because it hits the bucking lips, which another issue in this gun is that in general the barrel is held too far into the hop-up chamber, and the bucking lips actually extend over the feed tube, and they cause feeding issues. So eventually you can correct this by moving the barrel outward slightly. But what this does is that the barrel, since it can't lock in place, the air nozzle hits your bucking and it slowly moves the barrel outward, away from your gun, causing air seal issues. So what I did the other day to kind of remedy this and get it to work for a little bit is I molested the barrel and bucking and the locking pin with Teflon tape. And I basically made it such a tight fit that the barrel it locked itself in place within the hop-up chamber, and I was able to use it for a little bit with minimal air leaks, because the barrel was, I basically improvised with a different C-clip mechanism to lock the barrel down. However, even with that, eventually the barrel did move forward, and I was losing FPS in the setup. So it's the way they manufacture the hop-up, they designed it wrong. There's nothing else to say. It does not hold your barrel in place, and if it was to hold your barrel in place, it holds it back way too far, creating feeding issues, because the bucking lips jam up with the air nozzle. Now, to tell you the little things I've done, I've shaved down the bucking lips. I've shaved down my air nozzle a significant, 3 millimeters. That's a lot for an air nozzle. That's what distinguishes which air nozzle the gun is for, how long it is. My M4, I have a ZCI M4 air nozzle, and that is, I guess, it's supposed to be on the longer side, but it's shorter than SHS. So it's not overly long for an M4 air nozzle. And I had to shave that down a whole 2.5, 3 millimeters, and it's still having issues. It's simply not made to the correct version 2 M4 spec, which is sad. It just doesn't work. The air nozzles are too long, they're not compatible. The buckings hit too far into the hop-up chamber, causing feeding issues. When you correct that, the barrel cannot lock in place because the C-clip cutout is in the wrong spot. So your barrel slowly falls out of your hop-up. There's just so many issues with the hop-up, it's ridiculous. And then on top of all of that, the hop-up arm itself, they incorporated a nub into the arm. So it's a metal hop-up arm, and instead of having a cutout to put a nub in, they just filled that entire area with the rest of the arm. So basically, it's like a nub built into the arm, and this is honestly terrible because I don't know if you've ever upgraded a gun or felt a nub, but they're very soft, squishy rubber. Now, having a very hard metal nub instead built into the arm so you can't tune the position or where it is, it completely messes with the hop-up. Basically, if you ever upgraded to an R-hop, or if you've used an M-nub, for example, you've noticed they're very soft, they're very squishy, they have give for the BB. So the BB will hit it, and it's not like it's hitting a concrete block and it's just skimming it. It's hitting it. The M-nub material is absorbing the BB, getting more friction and more spin on it, and that creates a better, more consistent hop. The metal nub built into the arm cannot do that because it has no give. So it's just a terrible material to use for a hop. Now, they do sell arms separately that have spaces to put a normal nub in. I have absolutely no idea why they don't just include that with the shell. It makes no sense. There's no benefit of including the arm. There's no benefit of even making the arm that they have included. It's just a worse design, especially since they already have properly made ones. So that's just a little thing that angered me. Is it worsens the performance of the shell for no savings and cost. There's no reason to add it there.
Like me being a hop up kind of there are three things I really like to do in Airsoft. One is build trigger response setups. The other one is build motors, and the third one is mess around with hop-up units because I really like accuracy and range. And just that is so stupid. I don't get the point in that, honestly. How you're saying, it's a one piece. Sure, it's easier to machine probably, and it's easier for them to just kind of throw out and be like, hey, you're never gonna lose your nub again. But I don't know very many people that are gonna buy this shell and try to use that setup, because if you buy that shell, more than likely you're gonna be R-hopping, you're gonna have somebody else R-hop it, or you have the intention to do some accuracy modification,
Yeah, it's bugging me because it might have saved them a couple bucks in machining costs to not drill out a hole after they machine the arm, but it's so bad for performance. It worsens performance drastically, and I really, especially if you were trying to put this in a long range setup. Now I have it in a CQB indoor gun, so it didn't bug me too much because I didn't need it to be super accurate, super long range for the testing that I was doing. However, if I want to bring my gun out to the field, I would not have used that arm. I would have scrapped it right away, or I would have taken my drill out and modified it myself to accept normal, either a flat hop modification or a normal nub at the very least. It's worse in performance. There's no other way to put it. Alright, moving on. Magazine compatibility. I haven't been able to test it, which stinks. The magazines I've been using, Mag brand mid-caps, seem to feed fine when the gun is deciding to feed. However, because of all the hop-up and barrel alignment issues and the feeding issues that can naturally come along with that, I haven't been able to test mag compatibility because whenever there's a feeding issue, I don't know. I've been able to tell you it's not the mags for the most part. I've tried a bunch of different brands of mags, like when it wasn't feeding, and they all had feeding issues. But when it was feeding, I wasn't able to test mags because it was so inconsistent. The tension on the hop-up wheel, so the actual wheel, the dial that you turn to adjust the hop, it seems fine. There were complaints originally that this was extremely loose and it unadjusted itself and it wouldn't work. I have not found this, so whether this comes with age or not, I don't know. I haven't had the shell long enough to attest that it never loosens up, but at least as of right now, it's not loose.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interject so loudly, but did you do anything to your hop-up wheel at all, or did you just have you not touched it at all?
Completely as I got it, I put it together.
Okay, because
Did Jacobs have an issue?
No, well, Jacob and I think Corey, when Jacob first got his, he had to actually lubricate it was Corey that said this. When Corey first got his, he had to actually lubricate the hop-up wheel because it was so hard to turn. It was rough and you know that feeling when you rub metal up against metal in a bad way? You get that really heavy, rough, sandpaper, grindy resistance. Yeah. That's what he was getting. So he actually had to lubricate the wheel.
Well, I have mine in my hand right now, and 100% can confirm it's not doing that.
Okay.
So this might have been something they changed because Corey did have the beta shell.
Right. Maybe it's the anodization.
Yeah. So, or it could just be simply quality control issue. Mine just didn't do that.
Maybe.
Yeah, I really don't know, but I can tell it's definitely a tight fit. It's definitely not overly loose, but I'm not getting that terrible metal on metal grinding. I can barely turn it kind of feel.
Okay.
That was something I wanted to bring up because I actually heard. So not what Corey said. I heard the opposite. I heard that this might have been with the RA hop-ups themselves, not the split shell hop-ups, just the standalone units, that the wheel was extremely loose. And what this caused is that it would basically unadjust itself as you shot. So that was something I wanted to address. At least in the shell I got, it's not doing that. Spring guide durability. This is something I really wanted to touch on because there are multiple versions of the spring guide. Initially, the first run of the spring guides were designed terribly. The design itself was inherently weak, and a lot of them broke. The new updated design, you can tell it's different because the spring guide base is no longer red; it's now silver. That's how you can tell if you have a updated spring guide or not. As far as I've been able to notice, that's the aesthetic difference between the two. Mine has not given me problems yet. But again, like I said, I probably only put my gun through about 2,000 cycles. Definitely not any more than that. So it's one of those things where a lot of the strength things I wanted to touch on, I really can't test it yet. I got my shell the middle of last week, and it took me so long to get it together semi-working because of all the issues it had. And because of that, I just had less and less time to actually test it and put it through its paces and see what I can break and how I can break it. There's only one design flaw that I think it's actually what I'm talking about next, that I've been able to find so far, other than simply just testing the durability of the parts. So next, the cylinder head fitment. So, in the upper shell of the RA split gearbox, the cylinder head tabs. Now this is, if you're inserting a cylinder head into a version 2 shell, or any shell really, but just the version 2 shell, there's 2 tabs on the gearbox shell that jut out from the shell, and your cylinder sits right on those tabs, because there's 2 holes in the cylinder, and that's what locks it in place. So the retroarm split shell, those tabs are significantly smaller in diameter than TM spec. And what I mean by that is that the TM spec for the cylinder head tabs on the gearbox shell is 4.3 millimeters in diameter. The retroarms cylinder head tabs were only 3.3 millimeters in diameter. So I know what you're thinking, 1 millimeter, it can't be that much. Well, it really is. So what happens is that the entire diameter of the circle is 1 millimeter shorter. And when they're already only 4 millimeters total, being 1 millimeter off, that means a fourth of the size smaller than what they should have been. And what this also means is that cylinder heads fit loose, and cylinder heads can move back and forth slightly when they're on these tabs. And for those, some of you might be putting this together already, but when you're running an M170, M190, M210 setup, whether it's a DSG or full stroke, even an M150 full stroke setup, the piston is coming forward and whacking the cylinder head with a lot of force.
Jackhammer.
What?
Jackhammer.
Yeah, basically.
It's essentially what it is.
If the cylinder head is able to move slightly on those pegs, if there's space in between the cylinder head holes and the pegs, causing it to move back and forth, when the piston slams into the cylinder head, it will move back and forth. It will move forward, and it will hit the pegs, and all the force of the cylinder head will go into those pegs instead of going through the front of the gearbox shell. Now, the problem with this is that after a certain amount of time, depending on how hard the piston is hitting the cylinder head, you can actually snap those pegs. And if the pegs snap, your gearbox shell is useless because you can't hold a cylinder head in place.
That's happened to people before.
Yeah, and this has happened, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the first generation of the regular Retro Arms version 2 shells.
Yeah, it happened a lot with those. I actually had a friend, lives all the way in, I want to say it's Norway, I can't remember. I worked on the first gen Retro Arms shell, and that was a really tough build to do because there were so many problems with it. But anyway, I got the gun to him. It worked fine until it had Retro Arms issues once again. And so he did some work to it. He finally got it working right. I have tons and tons of work to it. And so then I saw him post a picture of it on Q&A that the pegs were just destroyed from the shell. And I was just like, wow, I saw that coming. And the funnier part is that now RA's rebuttal to this is, they say to use their cylinder head. You won't have a problem if you use their cylinder head, which, is a fair point. If the shell came with the cylinder head, I'd be fine with it, but it doesn't, and so I'm not fine with it. And the problem that comes from this is the fact that when he broke the pegs on that shell, he was using their cylinder head. So that's a big problem too.
Awkward.
Yeah, exactly. They were like, "Oh, did you use our cylinder head?" And he was like, "That's what I was using." So it was kind of funny. But RA's classical rebuttal there is use our cylinder head, which maybe it was just a problem with the old gens, I don't know. But I have a problem with that statement because they don't include a cylinder head. If they included one, I'd be perfectly A-okay with it.
That's the other thing I wanted to get on is that even if you say, oh, we'll just use our cylinder head, well now, if you're buying a proprietary gearbox, I would have loved to know that beforehand, before spending $160 on it. The other thing is that why even do this? Why make the cylinder head pegs smaller than they should be so that it only works with one cylinder head? When there's an entire market out there, 99% of the people that are buying this shell already have a build planned out. They're already buying other parts for it. They're swapping the shell in for build they have previously. So why would you make it more proprietary with certain parts? Because it's going to skew your market and screw over the customers. With that being said, so I currently have an SHS cylinder head in my gun right now, and the cylinder head hole is significantly larger than the tabs. SHS cylinder heads are actually known for having their holes a little smaller than normal. However, previously I had to Dremel out the holes to fit into the low neck shell, which is TM spec. And now that they're the right size, they're not fitting in the RA shell anymore. So, yeah, go figure with that one. But moving on from the cylinder head fitment. Oh, so just back on that, the measurements. The TM spec cylinder head tabs are supposed to be 4.3 millimeters, give or take. The RA are 3.3 millimeters. So, again, it's a significant difference in the size that is causing the cylinder head to move back and forth. And I'm not saying it will snap the tabs. They might be strong enough to withstand it. But it's an unnecessary feature that it's basically like your gearbox shell that's being put on a pedestal and costs so much money can break for the stupidest reason, because of a simple design flaw. And you're going to see that a lot. in the RA products, especially the split shell. So now moving back from the cylinder head to the cylinder, there's a lot of cylinder fitment issues also. Go figure. Out of the 8 cylinders I had on hand, 0 of them fit. And I took a video of that. I plan on putting that in my review. I tested a SHS cylinder, a ZCI cylinder, an A&K cylinder, a G&G Combat Machine cylinder, an Angel Customs e-bike cylinder, and 3 different stock brass cylinders from random guns I had. None of them fit. Not a single one of them. Basically what I figured out is that the cylinder window, the length is fine, but the width of the cylinder window is way too, it's about, again, a whole millimeter too restrictive. Now, when this cylinder window is it's supposed to be roughly 22 millimeters long, the retro arms was about like 20.9, 21.05, in that range. And what this does is cylinders legitimately do not fit in the cylinder window. The shell cannot close around a cylinder. Now, again, if the thing is always use the retro arm cylinder, well, you shouldn't have to. Like, why would you randomly make your cylinder window 1 millimeter off spec than the normal spec? It doesn't do anything but cause annoyance for customers.
Yeah, the same argument doesn't work here, as in, like, use our cylinder, because unless they include all different types of voluming and porting cylinders, that argument's kind of invalid. So.
Because that's the problem. So now I'm not buying a $155 shell. I'm buying a shell and a cylinder head and a cylinder and an air nozzle and whatever else that doesn't fit right that I have to buy your brand to fit. So yeah, not too much more to talk about. Again, all these fitment issues, I fixed all of them by modifying the shell. But again, I don't want to have to buy a $155, $160 shell to then go and hack it up with the Dremel to make it work. It should just work the way it is. If I can buy a $50 Lonex shell and have no problems with it, or a $60 GMP shell and have no problems with it, or a $15 JG shell, where I go into the issue knowing there's going to be fitment issues where the parts are tight, but that's manageable. It's so easy to fix. It's not parts not fitting. It's like shimming's going to be annoying because the parts are too tight, for example. It's not blatant off-spec parts that cause fitment issue. More fitment issues. Onto the piston. My retro arm shell actually wasn't as bad as I've heard with piston fitment issues. I tested Lonex pistons and SHS pistons because those are the 2 most common aftermarket pistons to buy. I didn't test any stock nylon tooth pistons because if you're buying the RA split shell, again, you're usually building either a really high-stress DMR or a really high-stress DSG.
Oh, man. Dude.
Yeah?
You take a picture of the RA split gearbox shell with, like, okay, the whole thing, just like the RA split gearbox shell with, like, crab gears, like G&G Combat Machine gears.
All stock shit in it.
Yeah, just all stock. You need to do that.
But like nylon bushings, Combat Machine gears, the little aluminum cylinder.
No, 8mm brass bushings. Come at it. Just like
that would be funny.
Caption it. Come at me.
Come at me, bro. I should do. I'll see. Once I get it to actually work, I'll see if I can swap in some funny parts and run a build like that.
That'd be just great.
It would be. So back to the piston issues. I didn't test any stock pistons I had because, like, if you're buying this $155 shell, you should have better than a JG carrot piston to put in it, for example. So I didn't even test those. I just tested the most common aftermarket pistons, which were the Lonex and SHS that I had. And I tested 3 different generations of SHS pistons and 2 different Lonex pistons. The Lonex pistons were a tad bit tight, but they fit and work without any issues. The SHS pistons, one of them fit without any issues, one of them had issues. And that's just coming from 2 different generations of SHS products. They change the dimensions slightly whenever they make something new. Unfortunately, it was the newest SHS piston that did have some issues, and I remedied this. I just widened the rail guides on the piston itself, only on the frontmost section, by about 1 millimeter on each side. No, it was 1 millimeter total, so probably half a millimeter on each side, and then it worked fine. So, for whatever reason, the front of the piston the front of the piston rails were too tight. Now that very well could have been a quality control issue on SHS's part with the piston, not the gearbox shell, but it's just something to notice because I used that exact same piston in a Lonex shell, and I did not have issues. Now, where this comes into play is that the piston guide rails on the RA shell were 2.03 millimeters in width. The normal TM spec is roughly 1.8 to 1.85 millimeters. So the Retro Arms piston guide rails, and if you don't know what that is, there's these little rails on your upper half of the gearbox that basically hold the piston in place and keep it straight so that the piston teeth are in contact with the sector gear. Those rails are thicker than normal. Now, it's only 0.2 millimeters thicker, so it's not drastically thicker, and I think that's why I wasn't having issues with every single piston I tried, because they're still within the range where it works. However, on pistons that happen to be on the tighter side, like the new SHS pistons that also happen to be made in China with poor quality control, so they might be like 0.5 millimeters off every now and again. Now, if they were on the tighter side to begin with and 0.5 millimeters off, and they happen to be tighter in that front section, since the Retro Arm shell is tighter than the Lonex shell, I had issues in the Retro Arm shell and not in the Lonex. So make with that as you do. The Retro Arm shell, I measured it with calipers. It is wider, so it is technically off spec, but it's really only those rare pistons that happen to be on the tighter side you're going to have issues with, and it's extremely easy to fix. I took a Dremel, about 10 seconds, and I just got some material away, and it worked fine after that. Now, another part of the piston fitment that's different. There is actually a part in the back of the gearbox shell, so the area that's cut out for the piston to fit and slide into, the very back is actually rounded off at the corner. And the problem with this is that in a full stroke setup, the piston will hit that rounded off part and actually jam up, and it won't work right. Now, I know myself, my friend Jacob, and my friend Corey, I think we all use DSG setups in our RA split shells, so we didn't really have to worry about this issue personally, but this is something I noticed where if I was using a full stroke setup, actually I might be wrong, Jacob and Corey might have used full stroke setups in theirs too. I don't know, but as far as I know, they were DSGs.
Corey has a... What does he have? Pretty sure it's a full stroke. Jacob's, I'm positive, is a DSG.
Okay.
Yes,
so,
because when I was like looking at it, it was a full stroke, if I remember correctly.
Okay, so let's say it was a full stroke. The thing with Corey, though, too, is he had a beta shell, so his shell is a little different than the first production run, but I don't know which areas are different. So let's assume that this thing I noticed wasn't on Corey's, or he just didn't have this issue. Basically, the back area that's cut out for the piston to fit, instead of the edge being a 90-degree angle, so the piston would meet up with the angle perfectly and fit together, it's beveled off, it's rounded. So the piston actually hits part of the rounded part before it's able to go all the way back, and it's just a potential to cause issues with the piston not fitting right. So again, it's like a design flaw where there's no reason why it should be there, and it's just going to cause issues. Air nozzle fitment. Yay. So air nozzles, they fit and work in the gun fine, but because of how off-spec the hop-up is, there's extreme compatibility issues when it comes to feeding and mating with the bucking. There's not really much more I have to go into. I already talked about the hop-up and the issues there. I'm sure I'll get back into it later. But, yeah, so the air nozzles will fit and will, like, cycle fine, but because of how off-spec the hop-up is, they don't work. That's the easiest way to explain it. Tappet plate fitment, same thing. Tappet plates, I haven't had a tappet that has not fit so far. But again, because of how off-spec the hop-up was, it just creates problems with the air nozzle and mating of the parts. Bushing and bearing fitment. So far, Modify Ceramics, GMP 8mm, I tested those two bearings, they both fit. Lonex 8mm bushings fit. So the most common 8mm bushings and bearings that I at least use, they all fit fine. The issue I found is that when you're using bearings, but this is an issue with other guns, with other gearboxes too, there's a restricted area to shim. So if you ever tacked on a JG shell, how they're extremely tight, and there's barely any room for shims, it feels like that if you're using bearings in the shell. Granted, my
like
Lonex shell, also does this. So it's not my GMP shell. To a lesser extent, it also does this. So it's not an uncommon issue to have. It's just something to the RA shell did not fix the issue. If you're using bearings, you naturally have less area to shim because they stick into the gearbox farther than flat bushings.
Are you wait? You're saying that the bearings don't fit as flush as bushings do?
No.
That's weird. Normally it's the other way around.
Well, this happens in every shell I've tested, like ever. Is that bearings? They're not flat with the gearbox shell when you put them in. They're slightly raised.
Oh, you're using Lonex bushings as your test base. Okay,
yes.
never mind.
Yeah,
because I would use
so
like SHS bushings.
That should be noted that Lonex bushings generally fit almost flat with the gearbox shell when you have them installed.
Like for those who don't know what Lonex bushings look like, they look like VFC bushings. But if you don't know what VFC bushings look like, then I don't know what to tell you. So,
go on Google or something. You're on a computer right now. But yeah, so if you have like modified tempered bushings, for example, those actually stick out of the gearbox shell a little bit. So those would be like more of a comparison to how bearings perform. Basically, I use Lonex bushings almost exclusively because of how flat they are, and they give me more room to shim. So comparing a bearing to the Lonex bushing, the bearing sits higher up than the Lonex bushing. And it just naturally, because of that, there's less room to put shims on and less room to change where the gear sits in the gearbox shell. Next, gear compatibility. I have not had a gear set simply not work so far, so that's a good sign. Again, I didn't expect to ever have a gear set not work, but I mean, it's just one less thing to worry about. MOSFET and contact housing fitment. So, I actually have not had an issue at all. My BTC Spectre dropped right in. I plan on testing the AWS Raptor MOSFET after I get the shell working, because not many people have those anymore, so it's not as important. And my old D-Boys contacts fit in fine. Now, I never tested the cutoff lever mating to the contacts to see if everything ran smoothly, because I wasn't running that in the setup. I run a Spectre. But the contacts themselves at least fit in the shell fine. So I still have to test how the cutoff lever interacts with the contacts.
I just don't feel like anybody should buy an RA split shell and then run mechanical
Yeah, I know.
I'm just it's just one of my things, you know.
That's one of the things I keep going back to too. Is that's why I didn't test the stock piston, because if you're buying a $15 JG shell, yeah, you're on a budget. You're probably reusing a lot of stock parts. But if you're spending $155+ on just the gearbox shell, I'm assuming you've already upgraded everything else. This is the last piece you're just kind of swapping out.
Right. All my nice guns have BTC products in them, and it's just sure it's $100, but it's super awesome. So I mean,
so worth it. It's so worth it.
I've put so much money into my guns, now I think about it. Dang. Sorry,
continue. I do too. It's ridiculous. Well, how about a separate video we do, just adding up all the money we wasted on the guns we own?
I could do that. That'd be a whole video for me.
Trigger fitment. So the two triggers I tried were normal stock triggers, and it's hard to say normal stock trigger because every single brand makes the normal stock trigger style. So I know I tried at least a D-Boys, I know I tried a G&G, and those two fit fine. I tried a Speed brand Airsoft straight trigger, and that also fit fine. Again, but these fit fine and were compatible with a Spectre, so I can't confirm that they're going to work with a normal contact block set. Now, I did not try an RA trigger. I hate the retro arms triggers. They're made off spec. Ryan can tell you firsthand, just from earlier today or yesterday, whenever he was working on it, he ran into huge issues with his trigger. I think he talked about it earlier in the podcast. I already forget. I know he did. I don't know how far into it he got, though.
It's bad.
Yeah, they're annoying. And unless you're using it with a computerized MOSFET, they don't even work because they're made so off spec. So I don't buy them.
And even then, I got a green retro arms trigger in from Brill Armory to just kind of test out around and goof off with, and I had to modify it to work with my BTC Spectra. So yeah.
That's so annoying.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, so I have not tested the retro arms trigger in the retro arms shell. I'm assuming it will fit. I mean, it's the same company, but I have heard from friends that their retro arms trigger didn't fit quite right in the split shell. So keep that in mind. I mean, I don't have it. I don't plan on buying one because I know they're made off spec and they don't work without modifying them. So I will not be testing that unless someone decides to give me one because they want it tested. So keep that in mind, that there is a possibility that it doesn't fit right. But the Speed brand trigger and the stock triggers I was able to try, they all fit. The anti-reversal latch. Bad news, it's proprietary. Good news, I like the setup much more than the stock setup. I kind of talked about this a little bit already earlier in the video, or earlier in the podcast, but basically, the anti-reversal latch, if you ever held one in your hand, it's a little horizontal latch sitting on a peg. And this peg goes into a hole in the gearbox shell, and there's a spring on the anti-reversal latch that keeps it popping out towards the bevel gear. It's hard to explain it without pictures. If you know what it is, you're going to know what it is. It's easy to pick out and know how it works. The way the retro arm shell works, the split shell, I don't know if it has this in the normal shell. There's actually no peg. It's just the horizontal piece, and you use a flathead screw to lock the anti-reversal latch in place. So what this does is, since there's no peg, there's never, ever any alignment issues with the shell and putting it together. And it never pops out of place because it's torqued down by a screw. So I absolutely love this design. It's one of the things in the shell that just make assembly, disassembly, maintenance, upgrading, modifying, taking the shell apart so much easier. Again, there's a lot of these small features. I think I talked about most of them in the beginning, but there's a lot of these small, cool features that just make working on the shell so much simpler than a regular shell. Selector plate fitment. I think I kind of talked about this one already as well, but basically the guide rails for the plate give the plate a lot of play. So when you're using a computerized MOSFET with those spring detents, they actually are strong enough to push the plate back because of how much space it has in the rails, rather than the plate pushing down on it, which is what it's supposed to do. Motor compatibility. Out of the 5 motors I tried, I was only able to get one to properly shim. This is one of the huge issues with the shell. One of the 2 huge issues. And this we're all going to try and kind of wrap it up. Basically, it plays along with the alignment issues I talked about earlier. So if you remember back to the very beginning when I started talking about the shell, how every single piece that contacts the shell in the receiver changes the alignment of the shell. What this does is, in the end, it changes how the motor contacts the bevel gear, which is really, really bad. One, it makes motor height inconsistent. It makes shimming inconsistent. It makes bevel to pinion contact inconsistent. What this does is it worsens the performance of your gun, and it wears down the parts drastically. There's no way, as of right now, to consistently and properly line things up and shim them and get them working correctly with the shell setup. At least that I've been able to test with the parts that I've tested it in. But again, I'm testing it in all GMP spec parts, which is what the shell was said to be made for. So this is what it's supposed to be run with. And the issues I had, most of the motors I tried, they were so jammed up with the pinion gear against the bevel gear, you couldn't even use them. So if you, I shim using the half shell method, and then I put the gearbox in the body, and I check play in the bevel gear. That's how I've shimmed for a while. I'm like 99% sure Ryan shims the same way. So if you ever read his guide on shimming on Airsoft Society, that's basically down to the letter how I also shim my guns.
It's really like the best way to shim when you think about it, but that's a totally different video.
Yeah, we'll talk about that another time. But moral of the story is, what you do is you put the bevel gear, the flat top of the bevel gear, into the that half of the shell, screw that half of the shell into the motor grip, and you put the motor in, and that's how you assign your motor height, because you can visibly see, because the shell's completely open, you can see where the motor is at the perfect height. You set that, you take it all apart, Then you put the two halves of the shell together with no shims on the bevel gear. Put the gearbox shell into the body, screw on the motor grip, put the motor in, put the base plate back on that has the correct motor height set already, and then you test for play in the bevel gear. And this will, if there's a lot of play, you need to add more shims on the top of the bevel gear to shim it closer to the pinion on the motor. If there's no play, you need to take away shims on top of the bevel gear to shim it away from the motor. And you basically get this to the point where you have the tiniest amount of, you still want some play, but you want the tiniest play you're able to get out of it. The problem with the RA shell is that every single motor I tried except for one, when you would put the bevel gear in this method with no shims on the top, and I mean absolutely no shims at all on the top of the bevel gear, it would still be locked up with no play. So this means that the motor was being held in a way where it was pressing against the top of the bevel gear. And it was pressing so tightly that basically it was giving you the signal you needed to take shims away, but you had already taken all the shims away. So what I did is I took the gearbox apart, I shaved down my Lonex bushing to get it exactly flush with the gearbox shell. I took off all the shims on top of the bevel gear, I put it back in, I re-shimmed, and only after loosening the motor height a tiny bit extra than it should have been was I able to get the tiniest bit of play in the bevel, signifying that it was shimmed properly. This is not okay. I shaved down my bushing so that it was exactly flat, and I had to take off all shims on top of the bevel. This means that the entire top part of the bevel is contacting the gearbox shell whenever it spins, which is not good. You don't want that. It's excessive friction. And this was the only way, and even at that, it still wouldn't work. I had to take the motor and lower it slightly. So technically, the motor height is a little bit off in the optimal setup. This is the only way I was able to shim my motor. This is an A&K high torque. I was able to shim a JG Red moderately fine the other day, but then I had a whole separate list of issues that I talked about with that motor, and I obviously can't use it anymore. Now to recap, so I was able to fix every single issue this shell had in terms of compatibility and fitment by modifying either the piece or the shell itself, except for two. And the two that I'm still working on is the alignment of the motor because of all the issues in the alignment in the body, and the hop-up spec, how it's so off-spec the way it holds the barrel, and it's creating velocity and feeding issues. I already talked about both of these extensively. They are the two biggest problems with the shell right now because they quite literally make the shell unusable. The motor issue makes it so the shell cannot cycle. The hop issue makes it so when you finally get it to cycle, it cannot shoot BBs properly. So I'm going to try and leave it at this because I'm still testing. I'm still in the process of finding more issues and addressing them and figuring out how to fix them. And I still have an entire video to make and post on my channel addressing all of these issues and showing how I was able to overcome them and fix them. But that, for now, finishes the talk on the RA shell. I will label it as, do I think the shell is worth it? No. Completely honest, in the current state it's at, I do not think it's worth the money. Even if it was only a $50 shell, I do not think it's worth the money, simply because it does not work. Now, granted, I was given this shell for free. RetroArm shipped me the shell. It cost me nothing. And they wanted me to test it, and they wanted me to find the issues and report back to them, and take the measurements, and tell them what they need to change to get it to work right. I'm still in the process of this. I don't plan on finishing this for at least another week, because I still have to get the issues I'm tackling right now fixed to make the gearbox shell work so that I can test the strength, test the cylinder head tabs, test the reliability of the parts, the hop-up wheel, how stiff it is to stay stiff, test other issues that I'm sure will pop up that I have to then address. So I'm still in an extensive testing process with the shell right now, and what it comes down to, though, is that I would have been perfectly fine if this was a beta test shell. The issue I have is that this shell is on the market. Like, people can and have bought this shell to then have all these issues that shouldn't have been there. these issues should have been addressed during beta testing or initial testing of the shell before it was released to the public and put on sale. I commend Retro Arms for contacting me, for example, and having me test it for them so that they can go back and fix the issues. However, they should have done that before putting the shell out for sale in the first place. And that's one of the big things I'm noticing with Retro Arms. It's just, in general, they're pushing products out that do still have issues with. Perfect example is the triggers that Ryan has talked about. How they're even now they've been out for so long and they're still not made to proper spec. They still don't work right, and they're still being sold like commonly. Just stinks, kind of.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, like, I was really hoping, because I hadn't used the Retro Arms Type B triggers yet, and I have one in a customer build that took me about an hour of solid work to get to work, and then I've got one in my DSG, which I had to modify to fit with my Spectre. So, pretty ridiculous if you ask me. But, we're going to have to actually skip over our current, like, debate/discussion, like, part of our outline, where we'll talk about, like, two products and compare them and argue their good points and bad points, because the Retro Arms split shell kind of took priority, but that's not necessarily a problem.
That took too long. It's my fault.
Well, it's something that needed to be addressed, I felt, so, I mean, I didn't mind it, and I don't think the listeners will.
If Retro Arms had less problems, I wouldn't have had to talk as much, so you can go and blame them.
First world problems. But, oh well, there's always going to be more podcasts, so that won't really matter. But I like us talking about the Retro Arms split shell because I had a lot of problems with it, and I didn't even own one. I just kind of helped a friend out with it, and, like, we got the best we could get it, and it was Jacob and I, and the both of us are pretty good techs. I mean, we're confident, and we know what we're doing, and it took a lot of work to get that thing to actually work. It had shimming issues like the one that Legacy or Ryan was talking about. It had, like, feeding issues that we finally got to work. It did all kinds of stupid stuff. So, I mean, it was pretty ridiculous, but we did get it working, working as in past tense, and it worked for a while, and then it broke down again. So, I don't know its current state. I'll have to talk to Jacob about that and figure out. But there's just so many issues with this stupid shell, and it's pretty much a failed beta. It's not even, it shouldn't really be a product on the market for people to buy.
It really shouldn't be. That kind of annoys me that it is already.
Yeah, so, I mean, kind of mad about that, but oh well. We'll continue to update you guys on our further findings of the Retro Arms split shell and just stuff about Retro Arms, because we're keeping a good eye on them, I guess you could say. But this will bring us to our Q&A section. We're just going to talk about stuff. My thing I'm going to be talking about actually isn't a question. It's just an experience I had this past week, so I want to talk about that. But do you want to go first this one, Ryan, or what?
Sure, I'll go first. That way you get to end it.
Okay.
So I'm just going to pull up, I talked for a lot this podcast. I'm just going to pull up two pretty simple questions that I got on my Instagram. They're very similar in what they're asking. So the first one is, where can I buy 32 TPA armatures?
Whoa.
So this is a question where people that learn about Frankentorque motors, they want to build a Frankentorque motor. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to figure when you don't know like anything. Basically, you heard about the idea, you want to build it. Now, where do I get the parts? So there's a good video on Valley River Arms YouTube channel. He posted it was a while back. I think it was titled something similar to How to Build a Frankentorque Motor or something along those lines. But basically, you need a neodymium motor can. Some are better than others, but as long as you have a neo motor can, that's what you want. An end bell compatible with the can. Doesn't really matter what kind it is as long as it works. And you need an armature that is, for a legitimate Frankentorque, you need a 32 TPA armature. If you find a 28 TPA armature, it'll serve the same purpose. You can use that one as well. And if you want to make a Franken motor, then buy whatever armature you want, but build it to whatever spec you want. So if you want to build a speed motor, buy like a 12 to 14 TPA armature. And if you want to build a balanced torque, 16 to 18, etc., etc. But specifically for 32 TPA armatures, you can't just buy the armature. And for most of these motors, you really can't there's no like market for just buying armatures as far as I'm aware of. You can buy a cheap motor and take the armature out and use that, or use the armature base to wind it yourself. However, to get a 32 TPA armature, you have to buy a Chow Lee motor can. Not can, sorry, a Chow Lee motor. And if you can't find them, they are the gray canned, black end bell, stock motors with the purple Chinese letters sticker across the side. They come in stock D-Boys guns, most notably. I think they also come in stock JG and SEMA guns if you don't get those versions with the high torque motors in them. And do they come in stock A and K? Probably. In the lower end ones?
I can't remember.
I can't remember either. The most common place I've found them is in stock D-Boys. I know for a fact they always come in stock D-Boys guns. JG, SEMA, and A&K all have 2 motors. The lower end guns come with a shitty ferret motor. The higher end guns come with 22 TPA for JG, 28 TPA for A&K, and SEMA, high torque new to me motors. Those are actually really nice motors, but they're not what this person's asking. Specifically for the 32 TPA arms, it is the stock Chow Lee motors, and like I know those are found in D-Boys guns. That's where I got mine. I think that like a JG Black, for example, I think that's a 28 TPA, not a 32. But like if you have one, it'll serve the same purpose. And look online too. Sometimes on Facebook groups, people just have old stock motors they're trying to get rid of. On eBay, I'm sure people sell like the Chow Lee motors they pull out of a gun, like a boneyard gun. They're trying to scrap the gun for parts. But used D-Boys is the 100% surefire way to grab one. And then the other question I got, which is along the same lines, was where do I buy my lipos from? So we've probably talked about this before, I'm sure we have, but I always buy lipos from online hobby stores. I never buy lipos from an airsoft store because the price is marked up ridiculously for the actual battery quality you're getting. Specifically, I usually use either hobbyparts.com or hobbyking.com. Hobbyking has a gigantic warehouse and selection of lipo batteries. What you're going to need to do is figure out what your setup wants to run. So if you're running a high-stress setup, you're going to want a decent milliamp lipo to last you a while, or a couple low milliamp lipos with a decent amp output. C rating times amps is your amp output the battery can safely discharge without overworking itself. And again, this is a topic for another video, so I'm not going to really get into this too much, but once you figure out what kind of battery you need and want for your setup, go to hobbyking.com, look through the lipos, find lipos from different brands that meet your required setup, and see the measurements. Make sure they can fit in the area you want to fit it in your gun. Once you know that, buy the lipo, snip off the connectors, and wire on whatever connectors you want for your gun, and you're good to go. That's where I buy all of mine. I've been through a bunch of lipos. I plan on buying more pretty soon. I always use Hobby Parts or Hobby King brands. I try to stay away from Turnigy Nanotechs. I bought them originally because they're really nice performing lipos for the price, but they have a very short lifespan. I really, really, really like Gen's Ace lipos. They're on the pricier side, but they last a lot longer than, for example, Turnigy Nanotech. And I'm experimenting with some other brands like Sky Lipo, Blue Lipo, regular Turnigy brand, and there was one more that I wanted to experiment with.
Glacier, was it?
Zippy. The Zippy ones. Oh, Glacier too. Glacier I've been meaning to look into, but are they on the cheaper side? I thought they were more on the expensive side.
I think they're about mid, honestly. Like I consider Turnigy like dirt cheap, and I consider like I can't remember the name of the battery, but they come in like hard cases and they're like real
Zippy,
expensive.
and Rhino are all pretty low.
Yeah. The Glacier, I'm pretty sure, is mid. I'll have to get back and check on those prices.
Okay, that's good. So those are the ones, like those are brands I'm still looking into. I know Gen's Ace works amazingly well, but they're also more pricier. They're on the pricier side in terms of lipos. So yeah, where to buy them? Hobby King, Hobby Parts, any other hobby store, but those are the two that I always go to. to you, Ryan. Whatever you want to talk about.
All right, so mine isn't a question. It's like a question. Mine's not a question answer. It's more like an experience I had this past. When was it? I am losing track of days horribly. This past Friday. Okay, so this past Friday I was in North Carolina visiting with some family, and so I was just kind of bored one day there. No, I was there. Sorry, I was down in North Carolina Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So Thursday I was like, I wonder if there's any airsoft stores nearby. It's something I haven't really thought of. Like typically I'm like on top of that wherever I'm going. If it's out of state, I always check for airsoft stores. So, but I was kind of off my game that day because I'd been to so many airsoft stores in the past month or so. Like I'd been to like Ballahack, I'd been to Fallen Warriors, I'd been to Nashville Airsoft, I'd been to SAF, I'd been to Mooseheart, I've been at like a lot of places. So I've been to a lot of airsoft stores, so it wasn't on my mind a whole lot. But I was like, I'm gonna see if there's some airsoft stores nearby. So I did. I looked around and I found out that Airsoft R Us, the guys I follow on Instagram, are actually in North Carolina, close to where I was. They were in Birmingham or Burlington, not Birmingham, Burlington. And I was in Durham. It's about a 40-minute drive. So on my way home on Friday, I stopped by there, and as I was there, they had like this big event going on where they were like selling guns for really cheap and having vendors outside. So there was a lot of people there. I was there, and one of the employees asked me if I wanted to look at something. So naturally, I was like, yeah, I want to look at this, X gun on the wall, which was the MA5B from Halo 3, and that's something I really want, by the way. But I didn't buy it because it was like $650. So that wasn't happening. But as I was holding the gun, the guy was like, I know you from somewhere, and I was like, really? Where? And he was just like, I think I know you from Instagram and YouTube. So I was like, whoa, man. I actually met somebody who watches my YouTube videos and follows me on Instagram. And so I thought that was super cool. And then I guess he was the manager there. I'm not sure. And then this other employee that recognized me talked to the manager and was like, hey, this guy is, the TheAirsoftTech from Instagram and YouTube. And the manager's like, oh, that's cool. So we got to talking and chatting and just having some fun. And, just talking about internals and talking about guns and all kinds of funny stuff that's been going on, etc. And then this other little kid, I don't want to say little kid, I don't want to, make him mad or anything, but he was, if I want to say an age, he was probably around 12, 13, somewhere in there. He had just bought a gun, and he was standing there next to the counter, and he recognized me too. And I thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And I just kind of had
spans all age groups.
Yeah, it was really weird, and I had a lot of fun just talking with them and messing around with some guns and just talking fun internals and etc. and all the escapades that have been going on. I got a free patch out of it, so I guess that's pretty cool. But unfortunately, I did not get that MA5B for free because that'd be pretty cool. But that didn't happen, so unfortunately. But no, it was really, really cool meeting some people that actually watched my YouTube channel. It was just really neat, honestly. So, I know that sounds kind of weird and probably slightly conceited or narcissistic, but it is really, really cool to meet somebody that you've never met before, that you have no connection with at all, besides on social media where they just follow you and like posts and stuff like that. And then to meet the face behind the screen, to meet the face behind the viewers and the comments that you get on YouTube channels and your subscribers, it's really cool because you feel a connection that isn't personal, but it's close at the same time. You really connect well with those kind of people. I don't know, I felt really welcomed at that store and really really, I don't know how to describe it. I was just really welcome there because not everybody, but some guys knew who I was, and so it was really, really cool, and I can't really put into words the whole the feeling I was having, but it was like a euphoria almost. It was just really cool. I didn't want to leave, but I had a 4.5-hour drive in front of me, so I had to get out of there pretty quick. But I was there for 30 or 40 minutes, and they asked me if I wanted to stay until the raffle, and I was like, I couldn't, and that raffle was going on at 8 p.m., meaning I'd be getting back at 1. So unfortunately, I couldn't stay. I do plan on driving back down during the fall. I'll be going back down to visit family again in the fall, and I'm going to bring all my airsoft gear, and we already set up, we're going to go to an airsoft field and just wreck a bunch of people, so, But it was a lot of fun. I got to test out that MA5B. I got to hold it and do all kinds of stuff. I got a patch. I took, some selfies with some guys. It was a lot of fun. So, I mean, I really, really, really enjoyed it. And that store was really nice. The customer service seemed fantastic. The kid that was there, I was having troubles with his gun, and the staff there was helping him out. And it was a really good store. I really enjoyed it there. So, I do recommend Airsoft RS. They seem to really know what they're doing. But the guys there are cool. The community there is awesome, as much as I saw. And I just had a blast in the 40 minutes I was down there. Really wish I lived down there, but alas, I don't. So that's just my little experience.
I've never had an experience that cool. But like, so just yesterday I was at the field. Pretty early on in the day, I was like, I had all my gear out on the table. I was still getting ready, and I went off to the side, talked to one of my friends, and someone who was at the field just noticed my name tag patch on my back of my helmet, which was like off to the side with all my gear, and it said my call sign on it, which is Legacy. Sorry, I was like kind of trying to hold back like a cough into my mic. And he said he saw the patch. He looked up. He kind of looked around for me, and then as I walked back to my gear, he put two and together who I was, and he was following both my and my younger brother's social media account, and my younger brother announced that we would be at our local field today. So he came down to try and see who we were and meet us in person at the local field. So I thought that was kind of cool. That like he didn't necessarily come like to see me. He came more to see like both me and my brother, and just kind of like people on Instagram that were like at the actual airsoft field, not on Instagram.
Right.
But it was just the fact that like he walked in and he saw my patch and he put like two and two together. Oh, Legacy. The guy's account is Legacy Airsoft. It's probably him. So he looked around and he found me, and that was just kind of like a cool experience to like meet up. I didn't even intentionally meet up with him. It was just like someone kind of recognized my name and put two and two together, and they had been following me on YouTube and Instagram, and they've been following my brother, and then he came and he met us there at the field. That was kind of not as cool as your experience. I would have loved to go into his shop and have the manager and one of the workers that we talk to and meet me and help a little kid and play with the Halo rifle. That kind of trumps anything I've done recently. But it's like, I guess, on a lower level, but like the same kind of feeling where away from social media, someone like picks you up and kind of puts two and two together, like, hey, this is the guy that I like watch all those videos or those pictures he posts and things like that.
Yeah, like the kid I met was having troubles with his gun, and he needed his gun working by like next Saturday, which is this Saturday coming up, and he asked me if he could just give the gun to me so I could go home, work on it, and send it back to him. And I was all for that, but he was like really young, and I wanted to talk to his parent, if they were there. And so I talked to his mom, and it was just really funny. He was like, "Yeah, this is like the TheAirsoftTech," and she was like, you could tell she had no idea what was going on, or she basically knew that I was just a guy that worked on guns, and that I had no merit to actually have like any form of popularity. And so she was like, "Okay, son, yeah, okay." And then I talked to her, and she was like all for me working on the gun, and it was really funny. But like just the whole experience was really really good. But I really want to go back down there just because I really felt welcome there, and I really felt like I could have a lot of fun there. So I plan on going back down. Cannot wait to go back. And yeah, it was just different. So it's not really Q&A, but it was just experience I want to share.
Cool thing to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah. Well, I think if my math is right, we're roughly at the 90-minute mark.
Yeah, we're pretty much as late as we can get.
Yeah.
So.
It's also getting pretty late where we are recording this right now. So I think we're gonna wrap it up here for this week. I know I will definitely still have more information on the RA split. I'll try to talk about it less and less, though, because I don't want to keep clogging up all the podcasts with, like, the same information. But, like, last time I got a lot of positive feedback when Jacob, Ryan, and I talked about it. We'll see if you guys liked it this time. I know I'll have more information on it, but you can let us know whether you want to clog up the next podcast with that again, or if you'd rather just kind of mention it in blurbs along the way and fit it into the normal schedule, I guess. Because we have talked about that for 2 podcasts now, so it's worth given the option to stop, I guess.
Maybe so, unless something like ridiculous happens to the show.
Yeah, unless it like explodes and fireworks come out of it.
Or
Cool,
Jesus decides to touch it and it works. I mean.
And it works. Yeah, I'd much rather have that than have it explode.
The thing is, actually, we want the show to work. We don't want it to suck. So I mean.
Oh my God, no! I've spent the last 5 days, maybe not even 5, maybe just 4. I've put over 24 hours of work into the shell.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Which is ridiculous because I have a 40-hour-a-week job that I also work. So the fact that I've put that much time into working on the shell outside of my job and trying to be social and get stuff ready for school. I know Ryan's getting ready for college. I'm getting ready to search for colleges and to apply to them. So we're both in a hectic schedule right now, and just the fact that I've put so much time into this thing and it's still not working, you don't understand how furious I was this morning trying to work on this before we were recording the podcast. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. We've just been busy, and already split shows that don't like to work have not helped. So, but with that, I think we're going to have to close this podcast down. We will end it here, and so, yeah. See you guys next week.
See you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.